So as I say, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us in what hopes to be a very exciting and invigorating conversation. We're going to talk about the state of Black media and what that means. And I think, one of the things I'd like to do for the audience, for people who are not familiar, is to take a step back and talk about this. And so what do we mean? Give us an example. Let's start with you, Dr. Draper here. Tell us about the Afro-American. I think that's a really good way to kind of start us with the history a little bit, and what that means more than 100 years on.
Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone, and congratulations, you're still here. It's after lunch. It's Friday afternoon.
Absolutely.
My name is Frances Tony Draper. I'm the publisher and CEO of the Afro-American newspaper, which was founded in 1892 by my great-grandfather, and so I'm fourth generation entrepreneur in the family business. The Afro was founded, as I've already said, 131 years ago, with a ladies, you'll appreciate this, a $200 investment from my great-grandmother, when reportedly less than 2% of the Black population could read. My great-grandfather had been enslaved. He was 52 years old with 10 children, and he had what I call the unmitigated gall to start a newspaper. Started in Baltimore, Maryland, where I still reside today, and somehow we have managed to continue this legacy, and we've adopted the theme, we're still here, and we're not a newspaper, we are a media company.
Okay. Tell us, I'm going to stay with you for a second. Tell us about what would you consider the most significant change in Black media or media serving Black communities over the last 100 years, if you could take us back without giving us the entire history of every community newspaper.
There have been so many changes over that
Right.
time period. Probably one of the most significant changes has been other people's interest in our community. We enjoyed probably for 50 or 60 years or more an exclusive right to report on those things that were happening in the African American community. On the other hand, what has not changed is that we are still the trusted source because we've been doing it so long. In terms of the Black press itself, the first Black newspaper was founded in 1827 by two gentlemen, John Russworm and Samuel Cornish, who said, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us." And so the Black press itself will be celebrating 200 years soon.
Great, thank you. We will get back to some of those themes there that you mentioned. And Latoya, you are the CXO of Glow Up Games, and so tell us about your Glow Up.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hey, I'm Latoya Peterson. I'm co-founder in CXO. My good friend Mitu is CEO, and we're the first all-women of color founded game studio. Before I was in games, I was a journalist, as I ran media newsrooms. I worked at Al Jazeera, I worked at Fusion, I worked at ESPN's The Undefeated with Kevin Merida, who was the reason why I'm here. And a few years ago, I realized I just wanted to go faster. I was doing a lot of stuff with VR and AR and AI, and I felt like traditional newsrooms didn't have the space for the things I was trying to create. And then the other thing, I've always been passionate about video games. I always loved them. I've been playing since I was 6, but ownership in that space is very low. Even though African Americans are huge players, sometimes we're up to 40% of a lot of the popular franchises, we are less than 3% of the industry overall. And they don't even count or track numbers for ownership. There are very few Black women. There was only one that I could point to, Jacqueline Beauchamp, who had a game studio before me. And so the ownership level, considering that gaming is, I think, up to $198 billion in terms of business, it's bigger than television, it's bigger than movies and TV combined. It is a huge landscape, it is a huge place of opportunity, and you are not seeing Black ownership there. So in 2018, I left media. 2019, we started Glow Up Games, and so it's been 4 years later. We launched our first game in partnership with HBO and Issa Rae in partnership with the show Insecure. We worked on our second with Oregon Shakespeare Festival to do a Romeo and Juliet themed kind of rap battle game. And then we're working on our third games.
Okay. Cheryl Thompson-Morton, I'm going to come to you. I want you to Tell us a bit about your work at CUNY in New York, and I can say those other journalism schools. As a alum, I can clearly say that. I'm happy to say that. Tell us about some of your research, and one of the points that was just made is that we exclusively had Black media to ourselves when others realized that there was a market in marketing to us, writing about us. I work at a mainstream newspaper. The quest for new audiences, is a more diverse quest for audience, a browner quest for audience. Whether or not we get to that reach is unknown. But the audience has always been there. When we were not allowed to read, we were still reading, and we were reading news. So, Cheryl, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing and some of the challenges.
Yeah, so hi everybody, I'm Cheryl Thompson-Morton. I lead a project called the Black Media Initiative. Our aim is to support Black media, the sector throughout the United States. So we do a few things. One of the biggest areas that we focus on is research. And so we have a directory of the sector of all of the journalism shows, publications, radio stations, TV stations throughout the country that are Black owned, or if they're nonprofit, Black founded. And so we have a list of over 400 outlets throughout the country who are owned by Black folks, mainly serving Black audiences, but not exclusively. We also have done some research in 2021. We published research, Why Black Media Matters Now, which was a comparative analysis between Black and mainstream media from March of 2020 through May of 2021. So we're talking about the pandemic, we're talking about Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, we're talking about the election, we're talking about the insurrection, and we're talking about the trial of Derek Chauvin. So there was a lot happening in that period. And we compared how is it that Black media talked about those major news topics and compared to mainstream media through that time period. And we saw really key distinctions. We saw that obviously Black media talks more about topics of importance to Black communities. We saw that in nearly 1 out of every 4 stories during that period, Black media explicitly mentioned racism or one of its subtopics, and that was across topics from health to mass incarceration to economics. We also saw that in terms of coverage in general, that there was much more humanizing language in Black media as opposed to mainstream media. And this was not just for Black people, this was just for people in general. We saw terms like mother come up when we're talking about coverage of Africa. We saw things like son come up in coverage of police brutality. We saw things like care come up when we were talking about mass incarceration and COVID and masking, terms that we did not see come up nearly as often in mainstream media. And then finally, we saw that Black media really helped to tie the current events to the historical fight for justice. So we saw that when Black media was talking about COVID, they were talking about Tuskegee as well. We saw that when Black media was talking about mass incarceration and police brutality, they were talking about Jim Crow and slavery and those enduring legacies in a way mainstream media did not. We also saw that they were keeping track of, as unfortunately new people were victims of police brutality, they were keeping track of, like, this isn't just a one-off incident. Here are all of the names of the people who came before them. A really unique practice that we saw of them keeping track of the Black experience and the Black historical record. And it really shows the unique value that Black media has. Even today, as mainstream media is focused much more on these audiences, there's still a really unique role that Black media has in telling these stories and making sure we're seen.
On that note, Dr. Draper, given what Cheryl just said, is Black media under threat by large mainstream news organizations with deeper pockets?
I don't know, we look at it as an opportunity. Because as Cheryl said, we have a context that other media does not have. And in terms of the AFRO and some others who were founded in the late, 19th, 20th, or early 20th century, we have an archive of 3 million, we had 3 million photographs in our archives. And what's unique about most newspaper, we call them morgues, is that we have the metadata too. We know who the people are in the pictures, and we know, what those were about. We have an original recording, for example, between my grandfather Carl Murphy and Thurgood Marshall talking about the Brown versus Board of Education. So we don't have to Google it. We can just pull up what we have. And so I think that because of two things, A, we have the deep archive, and B, we have the trust of the community. Trust is important, so important that foundations like Knight and MacArthur in their new initiative Press Forward, one of the things they're going to invest in revolves around trusted news sources. And so I think that it's an opportunity. Here's what we're finding, and I'd be interested in what the panelists would say about this as well. When other media invest, as you're saying, in Black topics, they silo it. It's the thing that they're doing today. It's a part of what they're doing. This is what we do all the time, every day. This is who we are. This is our core business.
Talk to me about, Latoya, I'm going to come to you. Talk to me about Black-owned media versus media that's catering to Black audiences.
Absolutely. Looking at media ownership broadly and looking just across the spectrum, you can look at startups, you can look at cable TV and cable news where I came from, you can look at, like I said, gaming. In each of these spaces, you will see that African Americans tend to be the trendsetters. You see a lot of mimicking of what we do. You see that in the dances in Fortnite. You see that in the types of coverage that's going out, what they call now like Gen Z language, which frequently sounds like us. You're like, okay, that's interesting. But the big difference is who gets funded to do these things, and where does that money come from?
Let's name some of the titles out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're familiar
So,
with.
there's a lot of news outlets might do like, oh, let's have a race beat. We'll do a race reporter. We'll have one person assigned to do race, and normally that person is set up to fail within the organization, which is a whole other conversation that we can get into later. But they will do one thing, versus Black-owned media where entrepreneurs or folks come together. So, earliest examples of this are things like the Afro, our magazines like Jet, our publications like Ebony. Essence was Black-owned for many, many years. And normally, again, like when you're a founder, when you're a startup owner, stuff like that, you have to make difficult decisions. Sometimes you're like, okay, to get more distribution, to get to where I want to go, or I've put 25 years of my life into this, maybe I need to sell now. And that's normally when you see Black media change hands, like the way that BET did, where it's like, okay, BET was running and things happened. It was sold to Viacom. It made the first two new Black billionaires, but it was sold to Viacom. It was no longer Black-owned. And then now you have every generation has a wave of like Black media startups. When I was growing up, I read Suede magazine, I read Honey magazine, I read Vibe and Vibe Vixen. Like I loved magazines. It was like the old school back in those days. And a lot of those things were imprints of other brands, but they were run by Black women. And the hope was that, just like all of us watching Living Single, like, oh, I'm gonna grow up to be Khadijah, I'm gonna have Flavor magazine, I'm gonna do it. But that landscape changed, right? So I came up in the blogosphere. I had a blog that I owned and managed. A lot of my friends, including like Jamila Lemieux, folks who, Lovey Ajayi, who people tend to know now from more of her social media presence, but had a blog back then too, became empires into their own right and started figuring things out. And then now there's this new generation of Black startup founders, people like Morgan DeBraun, who did Blavity, people who do like Travel Noir, Madame Noir. There's a lot of different smaller outlets, but then you start seeing this difference of funding, of sustainability, all the problems that we face in media, which makes those buyout offers really attractive, and what makes it difficult to keep things within the Black community, because again, the capital doesn't flow, the resources don't flow the same way, we don't get the same level of startup funding, we don't get the same level of investment to even start things.
It's a fraction of a percent, right, in terms of...
Yeah, 0.067, according to Project Diane.
Exactly. And so then there is a challenge, it is clear that there's a challenge, and what is part of the solution? How do we get to solutions to keep the Blaverities around, to have another 130 years of the Afro?
Well, I'll answer that. I think Cheryl's done some research around that. Collaboration is key for us. For example, 10 of the leading black newspapers in the country, media companies in the country, we've formed something called Word in Black. Yeah, it's a shameless plug. We hope you'll subscribe to our newsletter. But Word in Black, there are 10 leading black newspapers. We are sharing content, but beyond that, any other journalists in here, this is not for public consumption because we're not going to do it until, launch it until.
So we're off the record?
We're off the
Is that
record.
Chatham
You
House
can say
News?
you heard it first here. But we're forming a public benefit corporation. So we're actually going to have a company that we're launching in January of 2024. We are collaborating. We are pulling our content together. We have 9 full-time journalists already that we've hired using philanthropy to fund that effort. We've raised over $3-4 million to do that, and we post our stories. So we have original content on wordinblack.com, that's already there, but then we each contribute content there, and then we also spread it across our individual properties. So that gives us a whole different audience number. It's all about eyeballs. This is our digital startup. We're legacy newspapers, but we have a digital startup called Word in Black. So for us, that's part of the answer. How can we pull our resources together, pull them, and now the local papers that are part of this collaboration, we've become now a national brand, just because we are partnering with one another and going into business with each other.
Cheryl, what are you seeing?
I want to go back for a second before I answer your question to something Latoya was saying, because one of the areas where we see the least amount of ownership, and I always say ownership matters, it's really important. We often talk about diversity when it comes to who's in the newsroom and who's in leadership, but when you go to who owns media, it is even more abysmal than those numbers. And ownership is critical because those are the people who are ultimately making the decisions, standing behind you. And I know, I worked before in DEI in mainstream newsrooms. I know journalists who want to report on something, but we can't report on that. And having ownership who understands and is willing to stand behind telling the truth for our communities is really important. When it comes to broadcast, though, those numbers are really low because of systemic racism. Obviously, the FCC historically did not give broadcasting licenses to Black people, but just any minority or marginalized group in general. There were some gains in the 70s and 80s, but in the 90s, the FCC had some changing of rules. So now between women and people of color, less than 5% of broadcast is owned by any minority group whatsoever. And the business model is changing in broadcast too, but it's remained more stable than the print piece of it. And I think it's important for us to understand that we do have pretty clear numbers on who owns broadcast. We don't have as great numbers in terms of print or other types of kind of models because it's hard to keep track of everyone. But the numbers of who owns and the number of Black folks who own media in general is really low. I think in terms of solutions, things like what Dr. Draper was speaking to are really important because what can happen when mainstream media begins to focus on these issues is that they can gobble up a lot of the resources, and it makes it hard for the people who have been here doing the work and who can add a lot of this added context, and also they're there every day. It makes it hard for them to be able to gather resources. So pulling together and being able to have the strength in numbers, I think, is a critical solution and one that I hope we see more of.
To build on that for a second, one, if you're looking at issues of broadcast, right, because there was a brief period of time, 2010, I want to say, where there was what's called like a spectrum auction. So like if you wanted to get a cable network and you had the means, you needed to have like about $1 billion to do it. So again, start thinking like when we talk about capital, when you're doing television and like linear old legacy media, You're talking billion-dollar things that you need to offer things in the billions. And so you've got networks like Revolt, you got networks like El Rey, you got networks like Aspire, because they were selling off Spectrum. The other thing to watch too, for especially like this would be a great research project for somebody in the room, what happened to WHUT? That is the only black-owned, the only black, explicitly black public media station in the country. And it almost got sold 3 years ago, because they needed to raise money for the university and they were going to sell it for about $700 million. And there was an uproar because it's the only one. And so back and forth, but if you look, I worked at HUT very briefly when I was doing a fellowship in a Black Public Media fellowship. And how HUT runs, what happens, the funding model, what goes on, how it's proctored, that is a fascinating thing to look into in terms of why we don't see more networks like HUT and why like it's the last one standing. So that's the big one. In terms of solutions though, I agree that there's power in numbers, but it's really important to remember that we're always fighting for scraps. Okay, we have scraps. You have to remember that. So when other folks are playing in the space, like when we talk about like we've raised, like it's an amazing achievement to raise $4 million for an initiative, especially in news and especially with the decline of the news audience. But in gaming, $4 million means you're broke, like you didn't do anything. Like that is a pre-seed round. That is nothing, right? And so a lot of the stuff that we started trying to do was looking at how do you move with intention, right? How do you have angel syndicates that can come in? There's a group called Pipeline Angels that Natalia used to run. And she targeted me back when I was a media executive. And she was like, you should think about becoming an angel investor. And I had never thought about it before, never heard about it, had no idea what you have to do. There's SEC requirements. You basically have to make $200K a year or have $1 million in assets. And then you can invest in seeding companies. And that's how a lot of the companies that you love, people go out and try to fundraise for any of the things that you see that you love. And then however long it lasts is normally a function of how much runway they were able to get. And so a lot of times what we're doing is we're going to a community that has been systemically discriminated against, who hasn't been able to earn the same amounts as everyone else, right? So if you look at Viola Davis, she's always saying, pay me like if I'm the black Meryl Streep, pay me like I'm Meryl Streep, right? Because she's getting paid less, she has less to invest. She can't put more back into our ecosystems because of her pay equity issues, all right? And so like, this is how these things flow and keep perpetuating. And so like, it's great to get grants and it's great to get some of these other pieces of funding moving toward black media outlets, but I think there has to be a concerted effort to actually start moving the resources, moving eyeballs, moving what people support to saying we want to support this and we want to make sure people understand it's important to support this and not, you know, this gigantic corporate-backed imitation of what black media is.
As a business journalist, I love that this conversation is truly about economics and business and venture funding. So students, hint, hint, business journalism. But moving on, let's talk a little bit about, you know, where resources are and how they're shifting and what that means. There are a lot of journalists out there that are, as you said, fighting for scraps, and for them often, and Dr. Draper speak to this, it's hard to move into a mainstream publication because people at mainstream publications don't see those smaller community outlets and the kind of beat work and the investigations that these outlets are doing as, you know, say, New York Times, The Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal. So do we need to keep those people at the community newspapers? Do we need to bring them and bring their voice and their context and their skills to mainstream media?
Let's talk a little bit about, I think if I read your question correctly, let's talk a little bit about the value of local news and what it means to democracy.
Correct.
So national news outlets do what they do, and they are appreciated for what they do. But they're not going to cover your school board. They're not going to cover your city council. They're not going to hold your police accountable unless you have a terrible incident like we had in Baltimore, and that was not to hold the police accountable. That was just to report on it. They're not going to put the name with the face, with the statistic.
And a lot of these things we've seen have in recent years have been because of local black media.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. And so local media tends to be the more trusted voice in your community. And so yes, we look at the national news outlets, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, okay, CNN, MSNBC, and we can usually quote a headline. But let's look beyond that. What's happening in your community, and how does it impact your life, your family, your child? Those things are important for us to continue to report on. And there are so many news deserts now across the United States. There are places where people have no local news. So if you have no local news, what tends to happen is corruption goes up. Accountability goes down because nobody's holding them accountable, right? Especially in the politics, in the elected official space. And that's very, very dangerous for our democracy. So speaking of solutions, you have some people who are really focused on that, like Steve Waldman, the co-founder of Report for America. I'll put a pin there for the journalism students in the room. Report for America is a good place to look if you're looking for just a way to get into local journalism. They will pay for you to come to my newsroom. That's one solution. There's now Rebuild Local News. Steve Waldman, I started to say, co-founder of Report for America. He's heading up that issue, whole matter there. There are other efforts through philanthropy. I mentioned before, Press Forward. I'll say it again, write it down. They're trying to raise $1 billion just for local news. They've raised $500 million so far. They just announced it 2 weeks ago. They being MacArthur Foundation, Knight Foundation, and other foundations are recognizing that news can be funded through philanthropy, and you don't have to be a not-for-profit. A lot of people think you have to be a nonprofit to get that funding, and you don't. And they are funding. Did you realize that the Seattle Times, 20 of their journalists are funded through philanthropy, or 30 of their journalists? So there are other ways. Those are just some of the solutions.
What's the goal? We talk a lot about in journalism and journalism school about objectivity and not being biased in our reporting and to have a clear lens. And that has had ramifications and repercussions for years. It's a different subject. But when we talk about the Black media and the Black press and being trusted in the community, is it objectivity versus responsibility? Anyone on this panel, you can go.
I'll defer to Cheryl. I'll weigh in after Cheryl and Latoya.
Yeah, I want to defer to you, Dr. Draper, but I'll try to kick it off. You know, I think the Black press is often called an advocacy press, and that's in part because as opposed to the objectivity lens that is typically talked about, I think, you know, in the broader American journalism context, Black media, as Dr. Draper said, started in 1827 in New York City when slavery was still legal even in New York State, right? Like, I mean, we're talking about a time when literally these two free men were seeing people walk by them and they were literally enslaved. So it's really hard to say, oh, I'm just gonna have a neutral lens on slavery, right? There isn't a neutral stance on that. And I think what the Black press says is there are certain topics in which there's a clear right and wrong, and we are going to speak the truth because really for most of American history in which the Black press has been here, there was nowhere else you could get that perspective. And so Black press and the Black media had to be that voice. I think Black media's aim is always to be fair. That doesn't mean to have like a hands-off casual observer approach though, because
A dispassionate
a
neutrality,
dispassionate view, because we're living these things. We're talking about stories where I know that person, right? We live in these communities. These issues aren't I don't have a dispassionate stance, and I'm not going to pretend to. And that's part of the reason why Black media became so trusted and is so trusted, because there is a view, and I think a reality, that they will actually stand up for causes that they believe in. They have a stance. You know where they stand. And I think that builds trust because I understand what you're trying to do and what you're trying to come across. So it's a different perspective. It doesn't mean skewing the facts. It doesn't mean not being fact-based. All of those things of reporting, the reporting chops are still there, fact-checking, all of those things. But we also understand that there are things that we need to hold there are times we need to hold power to account.
Yeah, I'd like to just reframe for a second, because I feel like we've been rehashing this kind of objectivity versus like advocacy, and that is not the environment we are in right now. We are in an out culture war. Okay, so when you are looking at what is happening in politics, when you are looking at Florida reviewing libraries and trying to pull books because they mention racism, right? They messed up because they tried to pull Roberto Clemente's biography, and people were like, oh, you can't just do that because he said something racist. The way in which people have tried to systematically attack the press and to defang the press. You know, you talk about local media, right? West Palm Beach Post brought down Epstein. It wouldn't have happened other places because of the relationships that people have to power. A lot of Black media rose to prominence because we were reporting on stories that mainstream media chose not to. In News for All the People, they talk about how the New York Times did not report lynchings, did not report hangings. Nicole Hannah-Jones did that whole project before 1619. Before 1619, that project that she did, I forgot what it's called, but it was notable obituaries. She went back and did obituaries of notable people that were skipped because the New York Times did not think they were important, right? Like there's so many luminaries on that list that they fixed. Anything we choose as news programmers, like you learn this if you go to news program training, anything we choose, we are making a decision about what is important to know in the world and what is not. And these
Tulsa
are
race massacre.
yeah,
People
like
in
how we
Tulsa
message
didn't
it.
even
What is
realize
important? I remember sitting there and arguing when I was at Al Jazeera, sitting and arguing with, at that time, my white supervisor that Ferguson was a story. And we were watching it, we saw it on social media, we were on a social media-based news show, obviously, we were getting everything. And we were like, this is a story. And it took us 2 months, almost 2 months, because we were watching it, it was fomenting, things were happening. We were like, something is brewing here in Ferguson and we need to pay attention. And we could not get that buy-in. And we did not get that buy-in until Mike Brown. There were rumbles happening before then. There were things happening before then. There were investigations happening before then. All these things were rumbling in local news. They were known on social media. They were known. And we could not get them to look until it took that tragedy for them to be like, let's take this story seriously. Then it became one of Al Jazeera's top stories. It was one of the top stories on the network because the cops directly attacked a reporter. And it blew up and it became huge. But again, it's the Black reporters in the newsroom who are normally going, like, this is important, sound the alarm. And there's normally somebody that can overrule it. And when you look at this writ large, when you look at how few of us make it in journalism, because we have student loans, we have bills to pay, we have family members to support, people go into PR, they go into comms a lot faster. You see, we tend to be last hired, first fired. There are all these trends that have been going since the 70s, since the 80s, that are still very present, and you see less folks who are willing to sit and dig, who have the contacts, who can advocate for these types of stories. So I'm like, I don't think it's an objectivity, like if we're arguing about objectivity in an environment where most people are opting out of news content totally,
Correct.
they don't care to watch it, right? One of the talks that I used to give at ONA all the time, the Online News Association, and the thing that ultimately propelled me out was in journalism, we were talking about fighting for minutes of people's time, engagement minutes. And in games, we talk about it in terms of days, hours and days. A game that you like, you'll play 20, 30, 40 hours. We're supposed to talk about disinformation at some point.
I was getting
right?
there.
I know you're getting there.
I'm waiting.
But just to tie that bridge, right?
To tie that bridge. For me.
There is less local media.
Correct.
There is less funding for local reporters to do these news stories. So when people have questions, where are they going? They're going to the Call of Duty lobbies, they're going to Reddit, they're going to TikTok, they're going to forums, and it's easy to see things like deepfakes. It's easy to propagate false narratives. It's easy to clip something and have it go viral, and most people do not anymore have the media literacy training. They don't have that type of instruction in schools anymore by design. They don't know where to go to verify this, to figure out, hey, this is an answer, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. And so you're seeing this rise, and you're seeing it because it's enabled by all these other alternate platforms that people are getting information from in a way that news has not engaged in, and news does not even understand the conversations that are happening in these places. I'm seeing news organizations on TikTok now, but almost nobody is in the spaces that I'm in.
Right. So let's talk about that, because there is that vacuum and people are going other places, and disinformation is a very real thing as we barrel towards the 2024 election. People are going to try to play with that trust that we talked about, right? And particularly in certain communities and Black communities, Black men and Latino communities. Tell me what you're thinking about that, how you're trying to safeguard your worlds in your community, because it is very easy for someone elsewhere to come in online with a very legitimate looking newspaper in a small community in Baltimore. So, and just sort of wreck the trust that, you know, people have built over decades. So how do you think about disinformation and trying to ensure that your communities, you know, have accurate information to make the choices they really need to make in their lives?
So we think about it in reverse. We think about not so much trying to prevent someone else from misinformation, because that's always going to happen. We try to make sure that what we put out there is accurate information. Do we have a certain lens? Absolutely. But so does every single media outlet in America. If I called out certain news outlets now, you know whether they're left-leaning or right-leaning, or, you know, we know that. And people...
Please don't do that.
I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. You're at the Journal. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to. And so what we charge our journalists to do is to make sure, what you write is accurate. Do we have an opinion on things? Yes. Do we advocate openly for those issues that we think are important to our community? Yes. How do we know that? We ask them. We survey them. We use data to determine some of the things that we cover and some of the things that we say. Are we clearly pro-Black? Yes. There's no shame in our game. We are the Afro. Okay? The name Afro was there before my great-grandfather purchased it at the auction. The name was there. So it's not, it wasn't novel for us. So we don't pretend to be who we're not. And we cover from that lens. I'll give you this example, and then, you know, we'll move on. I was on a panel with a Baltimore Sun reporter about how lynching was covered by both our publications. And here's what he said. He said, the Sun covered lynching in Maryland as just something that happened. The Afro sat at the kitchen table with that mother and said, tell me about your son. We do that today. It's not just another statistic. We look into the life of that person, find out who he was, who she was, whether it's something that was, you know, tragic or something that's happy. So I already know we want to do a story about Latoya. She doesn't know it, I just told her. We want to do a story about Latoya, given the space that she's now in. We've done a story about Cheryl. Watch out, it might be coming your way, okay? And some of the things that we've heard here. So there's no shame in our game.
I'd like to jump in on the disinformation piece. You know, one of the interesting things about the way the internet has allowed disinformation to propagate is that it allows disinformation to be really nichely targeted to specific groups. Specifically when we're talking about Black communities, but, you know, at my center we have a Latino media initiative, we have an Asian media initiative. So we see this across the ecosystem. These nichely targeted messages really poke at ways at which the communities need to be skeptical of traditional messaging, specifically from the government, right? I mean, when you think about some of the historical context that our communities come from, some of these things that would have been disinformation at the time actually turned out to be the truth. Like, you think about the Tuskegee experiment and what was happening. If someone would have said back then, like, oh yeah, they're shooting these people up with syphilis and just waiting to see what happens, the government would have came out with a message like, no, that's not what's happening here, right? And so the actors in the disinformation sphere use those realities and use the natural skepticism that our communities have, understandably so, to help propagate things that actually may not be in our best interest. So I'm from Philly, and I used to work at an outfit in Philly, and we did research on disinformation, specifically on Black voters in Philadelphia. Let me tell you, millions of tweets targeted at Black Philadelphian voters about don't vote for the president, We're not voting for the president because we want to prove a point. We're not Democratic. We're not Republican. Just vote down ballot. This, we knew, based on our research, these were Russian bots trying to make sure that the Black community in Philadelphia didn't vote, to try to make sure that the state of Pennsylvania went red. But the things that they were pointing out were real concerns. They were poking at real issues. And so what Black media can do, and one of the things we saw in the research that we conducted, when it came to COVID, obviously there was a ton of misinformation targeted at the Black community about that. And what Black media did, they didn't say, oh, that's stupid that you feel this way about this vaccine. They were like, yeah, y'all are talking about Tuskegee? That happened, right? That's real. There's like systemic medical racism. Here are the reasons why you should consider a different option, and trust people to be smart enough to be able to make those decisions when they have the facts in front of them from a trusted source. And that's why the organizations within the community can be really important in helping to counteract, because when you have the trust and you can give the facts, it really helps to make a difference. And we saw that it helped to improve rates within the community of vaccination and other things as well.
Right, Latoya, you're in the tech sphere, so talk to us on that same topic and about how generative AI makes this an exponential problem going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, like, there's two ways you could tackle this. I'm going to keep it to AI for this one, but I just want to make sure I put into everybody's sphere. Think about how algorithmic control of what you're seeing, of what you're doing, impacts the amount of filtering that you receive of the messages. The word that Cheryl keeps using is targeting. It is absolutely targeted. These are intentional messages that you are receiving. And when you look at something like, they've done studies on YouTube's algorithm, they've done studies on TikTok's algorithm, how far are you from extremist content? Because that is the thing that gets engagement, clicks, things like that. You will be there in 3-4 clicks. There's a whole lot of studies on that. But let's talk about generative AI for a moment, because that's my wheelhouse. There's a dope group called Blacks in AI. Love them forever. Dr. Tim Nick Gabru, who most famously got kicked out of Google for being like, this is racist, this is bullshit, but is one of the co-founders. I'm in Blacks in AI. Love it, cannot recommend this enough. If you are remotely interested, you should join. But Blacks in AI really started looking at how all of these different things are being used, because there are so many different ways to leverage artificial intelligence. In gaming, we use it for all kinds of different things already. How your enemies move is controlled by AI. What is happening? And then ChatGPT blew up. And people were like, oh, look at this revolution, look at what's happening. What is the data source that ChatGPT is pulling from? Where is all of that coming from? What are they doing? Because normally they're scraping large sections of the internet, right? It could be anything. It could be extremist content. A lot of times it's Reddit, or it's places like 4chan, which you know are explicitly racist and explicitly toxic, but also open archive. MIT down the street uses 4chan images when they're cataloging memes. And I was at one of these conferences, I'll talk about Joan Donovan in a second, but I was at one of these conferences and I looked at the board and they were like, we're cataloging all these memes and like, what is substantial on internet culture today? And I looked and I was like, you realize there's no Black people, right? You have 2 million images and there is not a single Black face. That is not an accident. On 4chan, 4chan is racist. They don't like us. At that time, at that period of time, one of the most popular memes that we were seeing was Cardi B. She was doing some kind of like dancing, you know, whatever. But that was all over the internet. That was everywhere. That was nowhere to be found on that page, because 4chan is explicitly a white supremacist space. You're not going to see Black people unless they are mocking us. That you're not, and they generally just don't even bother with that iconography. So if that is the base you're using to say this is internet culture, we are not there. When you look at, again, stuff like Lyrebird, you can imitate somebody's voice. When you look at deepfakes, where it's becoming so easy now to create an avatar in somebody's likeness and just move the mouth. Better, easier and easier and easier to contort something that you want to say. Some of it is just even just like selective editing. It doesn't have to be that sophisticated, where it's like, have something in the style of Joe Biden say this, and then I'll put it up and pretend this is a real news clip, and most people will not check.
Right. You don't need to be an expert, and you don't need to have any money.
Yeah.
Right.
And so a lot of that, again, comes down to, okay, can I check my source? Can I check my facts? But most people are not getting that type of instruction anymore. Or they're like, oh, the facts, they were listed at the bottom, but they don't realize you got to follow the link out. Is this a real link? Because a lot of times people, you'll see these, especially with like a lot of these agitators online, especially at TikTok. They'll be like, look at my sources. They'll put up like 16 articles on the green screen, and then you go look at the actual source, and you're like, oh, that's not even a real news site. Like, this is like one of those weird click hole things. Like, what is this?
But
and
you
it's
have
like
to know that
the
you
headline
also
looks
have
good
to
behind the
realize
green
it's
screen,
not a
but that's
real news
it.
site, right?
Yeah, it's not real. But that amount of going and checking, especially in an environment where we're like, everybody's trying to crunch everything into a 15-second video in your endless scroll that's designed to keep you engaged for 4 or 5 hours at a time, just consuming content. What content plays? It's not objective content, because that's stuff you have to sit, digest, think about. You might not respond to it right away. You got to do it. It is what is the most extreme, and that's how you get a lot of this polarization.
All right. We are going to go to audience Q&A. Questions? We have someone with the mic in the audience.
Hi, I'm Deidre. I'm a BU student here. I'm a graduate student for journalism. And I am interested in writing about race and social justice. And I've been hearing from some of my mentors that to make sure that you don't pigeonhole yourself. But I'm very passionate about primarily us, and hopefully one day would like to work at a Black press media outlet. What is your advice for me as far as being a student here and remaining open, but also staying authentic to who I am as a Black woman and a journalist?
So I had to go through that same thing. So I started out a race blogger. I had a blog called Racialicious. And all of my clips were about race, and I knew I was going to get pigeonholed at some point. That has not changed my mission, my mandate. As you can see, now I'm over here with this woman of color start a game studio. I'm yelling about algorithms and blacks in AI. I'm being insane. I'm doing the same thing I've always done. But you make sure you have a broader clip base so that people can't pigeonhole you. The problem with race reporting is they try to keep you in that box where if you ask for other assignments, if you try to go onto the business beat, and you go, hey, this is a structural housing policy issue, actually. Let's get this in the A1s. Let's try to figure this out. Yeah, I'm old. I'm said A1s. I don't even know that even, I don't even know that's a thing no more anyway. That used to be important. But anyway, let's get this in the A1s. And people will fight you because they're like, well, it's a Black thing. Let's give it to Latoya. That's fine. That's great. That's what she's going to do here. Or at that point, Tanzina, or any of these other folks who have gone through that route. So what you want to do is be able to control your own career, especially in these times. And so I think you should always have the broadest level of clips that still mean something to you. Because at the end of the day, you have to do work that you're proud of, and you have to do work that you love. And that path will open to you regardless if somebody else says it won't or not. Your advisor is trying to help you have a longer career or maybe a more lucrative career, but you got to live with your career. And your career can be whatever you make it. So, I would say to think about the places where you feel like you want to make the most impact. For me, when I was doing race reporting, I realized business reporting was 100% what I need to go into, understanding housing policy, structural policy, gentrification, you need to understand federal procurement. Why did these decisions get made? What was happening? How do you go up the chain? Who can appeal this? Why did this get overridden? Those types of things would also help me build my portfolio so I wasn't stuck just doing race beat after race beat, because that, unfortunately, goes in and out of fashion, especially at larger papers. There's, you saw this in, dating myself again, 90s television. Black stuff everywhere, Black shows, everything was great. And then it was like nothing. It wasn't like we died. Like, it wasn't like everybody just went away. It was they just stopped funding it because they felt like they didn't have to do it anymore. And then it'll rise in popularity again. But to ride those waves, figuring out like, okay, I'm a Swiss Army knife. Like, here's my four. I'm always going to talk about race. I'm always going to talk about gender, but I'm also always going to talk about, for me, it was tech, AI, and I talk about business and housing policy. And like, those are the things that have always kept me together. And over time, you build enough clips where this becomes your life's work anyway.
I mean, absolutely, I would agree. I think there's one thing to say that I am a reporter that writes about, say it's business or say it's particularly housing, and to be able to do a wide variety of things or to have a specialty and say at the same time within that, I can write about race because these are the systemic issues within housing in America. I can write about finance, and thereby I can write about the Nigerian Stock Exchange. All of these various things, you can bring race into it. If you build, as you said, a clip set, as she said, a clip set, or something else, and say, well, I can do that, and now I'm going to take my pick of when and how I choose to do it. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, how are you? Kiana Saxon, the CEO and founder of Kadogo Productions, which is a children's media and entertainment company. We're a startup. And so if this is a question to all of you, what are you doing in order to make sure that children and teens are in the media pipeline so that they are becoming the journalists and the media creators and the gamers that we all want to see tomorrow? And if you're not, it is a plea. Please make sure that children and teens are in your media pipeline. As a kid, I just remember, reading the comics, making sure that, my parents were making sure that I was reading the newspaper, but parents are not necessarily doing that for their kids. And so it's really up to the industry to make sure that we're reaching out to them. So that's my question and plea. Thanks.
So Kiana, one thing that we are doing, we're intentional about involving young people in the process, school-age young people. I'll give you one example. We had a couple of groups of young people come to the Afro. They researched the archives not for history's sake, but to make new works. So they created new things based around the historical. So we had programs like that. We still go into the schools. Our school CEO in Baltimore has something called Be More Me, and she really is very concerned that young people today do not see themselves in media in positive lights, that they see a lot of yellow tape when they walk out of their house in Baltimore, and a lot of urban centers. And so we are working with the schools to do that as well, to get get our products there. And as I said, they're making new works. They may make a TikTok out of an old story, or they may draw something about it, but we're trying to do that as well. So you're right.
Yeah, in games, I don't have to go look, like everybody's there, but what are they seeing is the bigger question. And so for us, we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that, one, we make games with black-facing protagonists, which is something that gets you dinged in the games industry. They don't think it plays well in China. There's a whole thing about racism. They're like, how do you know black people are even playing? It's a whole thing. But we explicitly tell stories about black and brown joy. Because we want those things out, and because we keep seeing, me and Mitu grew up not seeing protagonists that look like us, and then we're still hearing from students. I just spoke at Coppin State, which is a HBCU down in Baltimore. I just spoke there to all these up and coming gaming creators, game producers, kids who are interested in esports, and they were telling me the same problem. It's been, I grew up, I'm older now, I grew up 20 years ago. And so it has not changed as much as we want it to. The avatars have gotten a little bit more diverse, but the people creating them, the stories they're telling, has not changed. And so for us, one, being directly in the fight, and then two, empowering other people to become creators is the thing that we focus on.
Any other questions? Yes.
Can you hear me? I'm actually one of the new owners. We just bought the paper 6 months ago. And I wanted to thank you.
That's an achievement.
And I think I met Dr. Draper in Chicago. Am I correct? You were running a meeting there. It was great. Thank you very much. I wanted to echo everything everybody was saying, but I also wanted to say that we're planning to expand throughout New England. There's a dearth of information about the black community in many of the New England states. And people keep telling us that we should come up there. For instance, I didn't even know that there was a Black Chamber of Commerce in Maine. I didn't know that the owner of the president of the Black Maine Celtic, or the president of the Maine Celtics, was black. So there's a lot of stories that are around that resonate with different communities, and there's a thirst for this news. I'll leave you with one other message. A few weeks ago, somebody had called me and said, hey, nobody's buying anything in my store. And I go, why is that, sir? He goes, is this the banner? And I go, yes. He goes, well, people come in, they see the paper, they pick it up and they buy something. But if there's no banner there, they won't buy anything and they'll just walk out. And I realized then how important black news is to the greater Boston community. So everybody who's in this room should know that there is a need for local black media, and it should continue. And plus, Megan Irons, one of your professors, works with us quite a bit, and we're still looking for reporters. So I'm putting that out to you.
I think we have time for one more question. There's some folks on the side there. Oh, come on. There was one more question. Yeah.
Can I ask one?
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. As the development of black media, people pay much more attention on blacks' well-being. So what do you think the effect on the black media development would affect people like white people, Asian, and we're Hispanics people? Like, what's the development of Black media would affect their well-being or like the diversity of the whole society? Thank you.
Excellent questions. Solidarity is essential because frequently what you see is that racism likes to keep everybody divided into tiny, tiny groups so that we stay fighting for, again, the crumbs. Junot Diaz calls this the wheel of oppression, where it's like we see what white people are doing and then ourselves and then we ignore everybody else. But what you see in media, so I mean, I come from games, I'll talk about that from this one. When we're in our pitch decks, and we're talking about the diverse media renaissance, a lot of times, Black creators are punching and kicking and pushing and kicking in doors. And then we start seeing other renaissances that have started happening, right? And so there was the beautiful like Black rom-com genre, and people were like, okay, there's diverse rom-coms, that can be a thing. Then they start looking at, okay, minority-owned books are blowing up, Black books are blowing up. What is the next market? What is the next thing we see? Oh, what is this thing that keeps selling? Crazy Rich Asians? What is that? How is that working? What's going on? You'll start seeing a lot of the actors being in different places. You'll start seeing a lot of folks collaborating in different ways to help create more of an ecosystem. Where we are in games, like there's just not that many of color-owned studios. We say a woman of color-owned studio because my business partner is South Asian. And so we tell stories about Black and brown joy. Her stories and my stories overlap. We're both brown-skinned girls. It's a different kind of thing. We talk about shades, we talk about colorism, we talk about some of the things we face are same. Some of the things, she's Bangladeshi, I'm Black, she's from the UK, I'm not, like there's very different things. But we came together to tell those types of stories. Brass Lion, another studio who also raised, that's Bryna, who's Arab, Munveer, who's also South Asian, and Rashad, who's Black. For us in gaming to survive, we band together and we look at each other's successes and we build on that. If you're telling me I can have a game like Insecure, I can also elevate the character of Andrew, AKA Asian Bay, and give representation to a group of folks who generally only see themselves in historical samurai dramas. We can be like, no, like here's a contemporary Los Angeles-based Asian American story that we can write with Johnny, we can write with this other person, I can hire this person, I can give them money. But Black media lifts all boats when we do something because people can then use it as a precedent.
Okay, well, I think that is a good note to end it on. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to the audience for your time, and thank you to COM. I do want to say in my history of journalism class, almost 30 years ago, I did an extra credit report on Black newspapers, so it is a pure delight to be here and to moderate this session. Thank you.